Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. It's exciting, right? I hope you're excited. I hope you're not overwhelmed. I hope you hear that and you start to think about all the possibilities of what we're about to get to do. I hope you watched that video. And for me, it was one when I was doing my research. And like some of y'all, if you're visiting with us, I hope you research Cinco Ranch. I hope that's going to look better and better as you do. But I saw that overhead shot from the bunny bash. And my mind just went to how many opportunities we have. How many opportunities come to this place that's already in a great place, but how many opportunities are out there are limitless. Y'all know I had a rough weekend, right? And you also know I love Greg Barnhill, because if not, there's no way I would put something crimson on my body right now, but he's got this little Greg Strong bracelet, so do remember to keep praying for Greg, keep thinking about him daily in your prayers, and all of our people in need. We have an extensive list. And don't neglect that. Don't forget. Don't just say I've got you in my prayers and then neglect to do it. Make sure that these people that are going through tough times within our church family, that you're consistently remembering. With the things that Mark was talking about then, what our mission of our church is, you remember it, you know it. It's to love God, love others, and reach the world. And when you develop something like this as a church, when you put it together, it's because it's catchy. It's because it's simple. Simple's in, simple's good. But it's because something that we truly and fully believe in here at Cinco Ranch. And when you think about that first one and the second one even together, love God. It makes sense for a church to believe in loving God, right? And it makes sense for this to be something that we care about. And it makes sense for you to come here and to want that, to expect that whenever you're coming into our church building. That you're going to be coming here, and this is the kind of place where your relationship with God is going to grow through the things that we have, that we facilitate as a church family, growth when it comes to your love for God. And then loving others. I mean, that's twofold. That goes within our church family, that you come here, and hopefully you're getting involved to the point that you're developing relationships, that you're getting those kind of friendships, those kind of bonds where you love people here, because it's hard to do this alone. It's hard to do the things we're talking about alone. But then beyond that you love the world. You know, if you're here this morning, I hope it's because you've watched Christians, especially if you're early in this walk and you're trying to explore whether you do love God, whether this is an option in your life, whether it's something you want. And I hope one thing that brought you into a church building this morning is the fact that you've seen the way Christians love people in a time where it's just easy to not be loving. It's easy to look and just see hate. I hope maybe this is a good time to reflect last week, take a social media hiatus for the next 3 weeks, I think, and just step away, because we can avoid that hate and we can love people at a time when so much hate's going around. But then this last thought, and going with our continued series of redemption, of redeeming the lost, is reach the world. And that's an obvious one. Any church, this should be part of their mission. Any church, it was the Great Commission, so it should be part of your church's mission. And so it makes a lot of sense, but it can't just be a cute saying that we have. They just, it's real catchy and it flows and it makes sense, and it can't be just that. This morning, for the rest of our time together, we're going to be in Luke 15. Luke chapter 15, so if you want to turn there, that's where we're hanging out the entire time. And in Luke 15, we have Jesus' interaction and his story, one of his stories, three of his stories, about what it means to redeem the lost. What it means to redeem the lost. And you can't understand the prodigal son, which is where we're going to spend most of our time. You can't understand the prodigal son if you don't understand the first two verses of this passage. Sometimes it's easy when you have a story you're really familiar with to jump in and to jump to the end, to jump to the story and to forget what the build-up and what the reason Jesus was telling this story was. And in Luke chapter 15 and verse 1 and 2, it says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" This man receives sinners and eats with them. Dave, can we lower that a little bit? I feel like I'm getting a tan up here. I can't. Every time I look up, I'm seeing spots, I think. This is what's happening in this story. What's happening as we start this is that Jesus has people that are drawing near to him. People that are drawing near to Jesus. What I want to challenge you with is the fact that it's really hard to truly know Jesus from a distance. And I think that's where a lot of us spend our faith, because when we're talking this morning about redeeming the lost, we're not just talking about redeeming the lost that are outside our building, we're talking about us. Sometimes when our faith is struggling, we're lost in the middle of our faith. And even when you have sometimes a basis in Jesus, sometimes it's from a distance. It's where I want to know about Jesus, but I want to know him from a distance. And what was happening here with Jesus is the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to Jesus. They wanted to be close to him. He had this appeal, and as I've said a few weeks earlier, we have to be that kind of place here at Single Ranch, the kind of place where people see Jesus here and they want to draw near to Jesus. They want to get closer to Jesus. And then the other side there, it says, Jesus receives sinners and the tax collectors. You know, that you have the scribes and Pharisees, and they're complaining, they're upset that Jesus receives sinners and tax collectors. And again, this is the way that Jesus functioned. This is the way that Jesus lived. Jesus didn't just tell us how to love others. He lived it. He didn't tell us how to reach the world. He lived it in the way that he attracted people. Here's the difference in the way Jesus treated the lost and how we treat the lost sometimes. He didn't just invite and love the convenient people. That's the easy thing to do. To invite and to love the people that are really easy and convenient to love. You know, you're probably not inviting Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I'm sorry I went political. You're not inviting them into your church. They're not easy people to love right now for half of this church. Half of you really dislike one candidate. Half of you really dislike the other. And all of you kind of dislike both of them, if we're honest. And you sit here and you think about that, but when you pray for redemption of a candidate for our country, do you really pray for both? Do you pray for your party? Or do you pray for redemption of people? Do you love people? Do you love the lost? Do you love the people? If you look at those people and you look at any celebrity that you want to throw out there that may embody all of those things that you're against as a Christian, and do you love them? Like, do you truly have that desire in your heart that you know that they're lost, that you know that they don't have Jesus, and you want them to have Jesus with all your heart? And Jesus goes into a couple stories, but then he gets into the parable of the prodigal son. Probably a story that we're most familiar with when talking about what it means to reach the lost, an example of reaching the lost, or an example of the lost coming back home. In the beginning of this story, we get to read about the son's interaction with the father, and we don't see a lot about the older son until the very end of the story. At the first, all we know is that the father had two sons. And it says that the younger son comes to him and he says, "Give me my inheritance." And this is really interesting because, first off, he's the younger son, so he's not getting the most. He's not getting what the older son's getting. And second, the father doesn't have to do this. I don't know if you've ever read this and thought that. Why did he give him this money? But there's this love that the father has and this want for him to have a sincere relationship with his son. And he gives him his inheritance ahead of time. I asked my dad last weekend. It didn't work out so well. He didn't give me the same answer. But he asked for this and he gives it. And what happens often in our lostness, and that's what we're talking about at the beginning, is kind of the journey of this lostness of the younger son. A big root of our lostness is our selfishness. When we're in the middle of me, it's really hard to ever think about serving others, to ever think about loving others. When we look at this younger son, and when the beginning of his journey, it's fully about me. I mean, this is disrespectful to his father. This is hurtful to his family. And this is 100% selfish living. And we see that he goes on a journey into a faraway country. So he leaves home. That's why later on you see the father talk about him like he was gone, he was dead, he was lost. When he leaves, he goes to a faraway country with zero intention of coming home. Do y'all get that? There was zero intention that he was going to come back to his home. He journeyed to a distant land. And our journey ourselves to lostness, to being lost, if that's where you are right now, it's not a single step. It's not one little move. It's usually a long journey. And it's a journey to a distant land, to a faraway land where we're trying to get as far away as possible from this. And then we see that he goes to the distant land and he has reckless living. That he's reckless living. In other words, he parties. He lives a wild life. He lives a selfish life, doing whatever he wants to do the whole time. And then he has a wake-up call. He has a wake-up call. And it's at the point when he spent everything and he's empty. And that's how it can work with us too. We spend everything, we're empty, we're out, we feel like we're done. But then still it goes a little beyond this, because it says that he spent all of his money on this wild, this reckless living, but then he still isn't quite ready to come home. He still hires himself out to this land where he's obviously making next to nothing because he can't even afford to buy a pig slot. He's so hungry that he's just aching for it, and he can't afford to just eat that. So no telling what he's working for. And what I want you to get from the story of the prodigal son is it's a story of repentance, but it's also a story that connects to our goal of relationships and our need as people for relationships. Because what really brought him home is the point where he realized that he was all alone. The point where the son wakes up and he has this real wake-up moment, and he looks around, and he's absolutely destitute. He has nothing left. He is aching to do something that is so awful of a thing, especially for a Jewish young man. And he says, I have nothing. And then he starts to make a plan. Verse 17, it says that when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger. I perish here with hunger. I have nothing left, and I'm ready to go home. What we need to realize as a church, if we're going to be a people that redeem the lost, is there are a whole lot of hungry people out there. There are a whole lot of people, and not everybody has this son's journey, and that's what we're going to see later, that not everybody has the same journey as the younger son. Some people don't get this hungry first. Some people don't get this empty first. But to know that he definitely did, that he got to the point where he had absolutely nothing left, and this long journey away now is starting to become a long journey home. So you have a long journey away, and sometimes that's when you had Jesus, and sometimes that's when you haven't had Jesus at all. And you've just been seeking everything that this world has to offer and running towards it, and this long journey back home and maybe wherever home might be. As he begins this, he starts to work up this speech, just like we would. If you put yourself in the prodigal son's shoes, you would do the same thing. If you're going back home to dad, you're swallowing every ounce of pride that you've ever had. And he starts to work on this speech, and he says this, I'll say to my father, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Whenever I read this, and knowing he's from a distant land, gone to a distant land, I can't help but dwell on that journey back home. And how scary and painful it must have been. It's long. And he was walking. He wasn't hopping in a Honda and driving away. He was walking away on this journey. And now that journey home. And even in that moment when he hits emptiness and he says, my father's hired servants have more than this, and he makes his plan for the speech, I have zero doubt that as he started to leave that new farm, this new home that he'd chosen, that he knew he didn't want, that he knew he wanted to go back to something different, he knew there was a better option. Taking that first step was so incredibly hard because you're standing in front of it, and when you're on a long journey back home, I mean, it looks so much further away than it even is. And then beyond that, once he starts to walk as you're going on that journey, it can become tougher and tougher. You know, that whole way home, he's practicing this speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. Please just accept me as a hired servant. Father, I sin before heaven and before you. Please just take me back, Father, not as your son, but take me as a servant. As he gets it down perfectly, and he's been working through this, and then he starts to get close, and this is where it gets a little harder. You know, because for me, I've lived away from home a lot since college. Lived back home in my hometown for 3 years recently, but besides that, I've lived away. And there's always, to me, this special feeling of seeing the things you remember. Y'all know what I'm talking about? You ride in your hometown. If it's Columbia, Tennessee, I'm coming from the south side, and I come off Saturn Parkway. There's the Saturn plant there, and I'm starting to see these old plantation mansions that were in Middle Tennessee, and I'm seeing all these places that I hung out, these places that I lived my younger years. And if you're this man, you think about his journey, and for a lot of us on that journey from lostness, is we're seeing all the places we lived our younger years. And he's seeing all the things that he did along the way when he was wasting his money. And he's reminded of the person he's been, and as he starts to get closer and closer to home, maybe that pit starts to grow in his stomach, bigger and bigger, and he can't believe that he's almost there. And then he hits this moment where you see the driveway. Home. And if you put yourself in his shoes, you can feel this. It's almost like, whew, deep breath. Here goes. As he starts to step, the father enters the picture again. It says the father sees him while he was still in the distance. And he jumped and he ran. And he embraced him. And he kissed him. He was so glad that his son had come home. And just like us, the son does exactly what we'd expect. He goes straight into this speech. And he's been practicing it. He still feels he's almost probably floored by what's happening here, but he still feels the need to say the speech. So he does this. And it's while the father's hugging him, while the father had just sprinted down the driveway and maybe had that fear of he's either going to kill me or hug me. I don't know which. But he gets to him and he hugs him and he kisses him. And probably harder than he'd ever hugged him since he was a little child. And the son says, Father, I've sinned before heaven, against heaven and before you. Just take me as your hired servant. And you remember what the father does. Hey, I'm going to need you go kill the fatted calf. Can you get the robe? And can you get my signet ring? Because my son was lost and he's been found. My son was dead and he's alive. You see, we're so distracted. We're on this journey back from being lost. And maybe this is you right now. Maybe it's your first time back to church. I don't know. We're on this journey back from lost. We have this thing in our mind that when we get home that we're not going to be fully accepted. We have this thing in our mind that we think this is going to still be a long journey once I'm there. And all I'm hoping is to be accepted as a servant. And God saying, no, I accept you as a son. I accept you as my son. You're no longer lost. You're found. We know the older brother. And he starts to come into the story. And the older brother gets a bad rap, but maybe because it hits home a little too closely for most of us. Because the older brother is out in the field, and even this moment, he's working. Like right now, he's working. He's out in the field. He hasn't left home. He's still out there working. And he comes back in, and as he's coming in from the field, I mean, this is a real party. He hears from the field. He hears from the distance dancing and music. I mean, they're getting down at the house. And this wasn't something that was planned. There's no family reunion. He's asking what's going on. There was, but he didn't know it. And he's coming back home, and he asks the hired servant, he says, come here. Hey, what's going on? He tells him what's happened, that your brother has come home, your brother that was lost and was found, and so your father has killed the fattened calf, and we're celebrating because he's back. And the older brother refuses to come into the party. He refuses to come into the party. The father comes out, and he says to him, he devoured your property. That's a powerful word. He devoured your property. And the son doesn't stop there. He said, he devoured your property and while living in prostitutes. Like he wasted it all. He wasted it all. And he throws it in his father's face. How are you going to accept him? He lays all of this stuff that you worked so hard for, that our grandparents worked so hard for, that our great-grandparents worked so hard for, that they accumulated this life that you were able to pass down to us. And he devoured it. Like he didn't spend time on it. He didn't savor it. He didn't use it well. He just tore it apart. And you're going to throw him a party? And the father says, yes, absolutely. That's what I'm going to do. See, what the older son didn't get, because it's the same message that he's given him, is that when your son is lost and he's found, all that stuff's pointless. All of it is absolutely meaningless. And he could care less about the fact that he devoured his property. The father ran out to both sons. It wasn't just one. We give a lot of this story, and a lot of the majority of what we read goes to the younger son, but realize that it's really parallel stories to both. Because he went out to both sons. The first son, he saw him coming in the distance, and this son that lived a wild life, and he runs to him. Second son refuses to come into the party, and says he goes out and he pleads with him. He doesn't just go out to one son. He doesn't go out to who we choose. He goes out to who he chooses. We like to be the ones that invite. And we get to be the ones that extend the invitation, but we don't get to choose who's invited. The Father chooses who's invited to the party. He calls us to go out and give the invitation. There are two speeches here, and we can learn a lot from them on where they go on their journey. The younger brother's journey back home, we just said his speech several times over, but the message of it is, I haven't. Like, God, I haven't lived this way. I haven't done what's right. Father, I haven't shown you respect. Please treat me as a servant. But then when we meet the older son, he opens with this, and maybe this can hit home with you for some of you. Look. It's his first word. Look. like Dad, look. I mean, if that doesn't exude arrogance when it comes to your relationship with the Father, hey, look. Look what I've done. And then he says, many years I've been here. I have never disobeyed your command, and you never gave me. So here's where I say that the two stories are parallel, because it's still all about selfishness. When we get drawn towards being lost, when we're pulled away from our relationship with the Father, the root so often is our selfishness. It was all about me with the younger brother. Give it to me and I'm going to go. It's all about me for the older brother. Give it to me because I stayed. And what the Father is saying, and he responds with, is your brother was lost and he was found, he was dead and he was alive. You are with me. When shall I get that? Maybe it's a word that you haven't really stuck out to. You are with me, always. The older brother that's lost in his brother's badness and can't get past this and is struggling, he's saying, hey, you're with me. And that's so much better than the obedience. That's so much better than the fatted calf. That's so much better than the party. The message Jesus is trying to get across is pretty clear at this point in the story. There isn't just one type of lost person that we're going after. We're going after the lost son, but we're also going after the older son. We're going after people who have abandoned God totally, like the younger son, or never had a relationship with him in the first place. But on the flip side of that, we're going after people whose relationship is limited by those same words as the older son. Look what all I've done. Whether we're lost in reckless living and methodical devotion that has no true heart behind it, or if it's self-righteous legalism, or if it's self-serving hedonism, like whatever it is, we're going after both sides. Both are lost. Like if you have self-righteousness, and you can be lost in your self-righteousness as much as you can be lost in your sin, lost in your wild living. We've gotten a lot better at extending grace to the younger son, but what I want to challenge you with also this morning is make sure you're extending grace to the older brother. Like we hear this story and we think, man, sinners and the tax collectors, and that's who he's talking to with the younger son. And yes, he's talking to the Pharisees and the scribes when he's talking about the older son. But make sure we're showing grace to both, because that's what Jesus did. And that's why he came here. We don't choose, again, who gets to be invited to the party. The older son is caught up in how could you. You know, he's lost in this. He's so obsessed with this. How could you? Question. What he didn't get, and what I want to make sure you get, is that the father wasn't celebrating his son's past. He was celebrating his presence. Hear that again? He wasn't celebrating his past. He was celebrating his presence. Do you get that? It wasn't about the past, and that's what the older son was lost in. Was his past horrible? Yes. If they sat down later and him and the father talked about, man, that was hard on our family. It was a lot of brokenness. This was a lot of pain. This was not something we chose. This is not something that's good. If you talk to the younger son, would the younger son brag about it? Can you believe what I just got to do? No. They weren't celebrating his past, and that's what he was thinking. That's why he was acting this way, because he was coming back to the party, and he's thinking they're celebrating what he's done. And no, it's the total opposite. They're celebrating the fact that he's home. They're celebrating the fact that he's present. The Father is begging us to offer this same kind of grace we received. Do y'all think that the younger son ever struggled with extending grace for the rest of his life? I don't think so. And that's what God is calling us to do. Found people, find people. I don't know if you ever heard that. When we say that as part of our mission here, Reach the World, is found people, find people. When you've been extended that kind of grace, when you've been come face to face with the gravity of your sin, with the death that accompanies your sin, then you find people. You go out and you bring this message of God's grace to them. And that was the father's end-all words to the older son, and where we end the story, is he says again what he had already said. Son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found. I was watching a video recently, and it was a lifeguards on a mission saving a guy, and it was in Australia. And the guy had washed up on shore, so they didn't even know how long he'd been under, how long he'd not been breathing. But it's pretty fascinating to watch. He was one of those like mindless clicks that I talked about last week, but it ended up being fascinating to me because they started to work on this guy, and you had about 4 guys that grabbed him immediately from the water and were holding him in the proper position and were carrying him out of the water to go work on him. And then you ended up with a group of about 12 true lifeguards rescue team that were working on this guy. And you had everything from people who were carrying him to people doing chest compressions to people doing the air pump and trying to clear his airways to people that were truly just the get back coach in football. They were holding the people back so that they didn't get near him, so that they could have their space to work. They had the defibrillator. They had the guy that was holding people back so they didn't touch him and get shot. You had the comforter. You had a friend over here who was the relationship with the guy they had washed on shore. And he's standing there and distraught. This is my friend. He just wanted to touch him, and you can't touch him right now. You'll get electrocuted while we try and bring his heartbeat back. And it went for over 4 minutes. And if you know the way that is, technically, legally, they could have pronounced him dead at that point, over 4 minutes without breathing. I think it was up to about 6, and that's not counting however long he was in the water, and you're watching this. But they work together, and they start to pump back, and then you see it happen. You've seen somebody rescued probably in a video like this, similar. He starts to spit up, throw up, he gets a pulse, and starts to breathe again. And what caught my eye, and the reason I clicked on this, was this quote. When you're part of a team that brings someone back from the dead, it's a day at work you'll never forget. When you're part of a team that brings someone back from the dead, it's a day at work you'll never forget. We have the opportunity here to be part of a team that gets this, that realizes what sin does, the separation it causes, and the emptiness it can bring when it's all consuming. But also to realize this isn't on us. I mean, if you hired me for that, I want to have relationships with people. I want to have friendships. I want to be like Jesus. I want to be friends with sinners, and I hope that they want to learn more about him. And do I expect to bring some people to Christ while I'm living in Katy? Yes. But you know what's so much more fascinating, so much more impactful, and the point where we're going to actually really use all of this for God's glory, is when you're part of a team bringing people back from the dead. You realize that when we came in contact with that sin, we are lost, we've been found, we are dead, and now through Jesus Christ, we're alive. If you're here this morning, you have any need, we want to be a church that prays together, we want to be a church that holds each other when we're hurting, that celebrates with each other when we have things that we need to celebrate. And if you're on any part of that path, because the truth is there's lots of different levels. There's lots of different places you can be on that journey. You can be as far away as the young son. You can be as close as the older son. You can be somewhere in between. But wherever you are on that journey back home, we invite you, if you have any need, to come as a worship team.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend,